Nearly 5,000 years ago, on the banks of a great river, people built a city of straight streets laid out on a careful grid. A city with public wells, with covered drains running beneath the roads, and with private bathrooms inside ordinary family homes. Comforts that most of the world would not know again for thousands of years. They built dozens of such cities across a land larger than ancient Egypt and Sumer combined. And then, quietly, they vanished. They left behind no giant pyramids and no royal tombs stuffed with gold. They left no palaces that we can point to, no temples to any towering god, and not one certain image of a king. They left, instead, thousands of tiny carved seals covered in a delicate written script. A script that, to this very day, no one on earth has ever been able to read. We do not know their language. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not even know, for certain, why they disappeared. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let me take you gently back to that lost world, to the forgotten cities of the Indus, the greatest civilization you were probably never taught about in school, and one of the deepest and quietest mysteries in all of human history. Come with me slowly to the edge of what we know and a little way beyond it. Picture a vast, flat, fertile plain, threaded by a mighty river coming down from the mountains, swelling every year with the meltwater and the rains, and then falling back to leave the black earth rich and ready. It was here, along these waters, that a people we now call the Harappans raised their extraordinary cities. Cities so orderly, so clean, so cleverly built, that the archaeologists who first uncovered them could scarcely believe how old they truly were. For these cities are old almost beyond imagining. They rose while the pyramids of Egypt were still new, and they flourished for 1,000 years, and then, over generations, their streets emptied, the river shifted its course, the drifting dust came in, and the whole shining world of the Indus was buried and forgotten so completely that, until just 100 years ago, no one alive even knew that it had ever existed. Tonight we are going to walk through all of it slowly, from the very beginning to the very end. We will stand in the wide brick streets of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and marvel at how modern they feel. We will look down into the Great Bath, a vast sunken pool of fitted brick, and wonder what it was truly for. We will step into the ordinary homes of ordinary people and find, in house after house, a private bathing room and a drain, a quiet, astonishing care for cleanliness that the ancient world almost nowhere else could match. And we will search, as the scholars still search, for the palace, for the temple, for the throne, and we will not find them. We will hold, in our mind's hand, one of their small carved seals, a beautiful humpless bull or a strange one-horned creature, and above it a line of elegant little signs, and we will feel the strange ache of looking at writing left by human hands, and not being able to read a single word of it. We will follow their traders across deserts and over the sea, all the way to the great cities of Mesopotamia, where the Indus merchants were known and welcomed. We will weigh their perfect little stone weights, cut so precisely that they still balance true after 4,000 years. And we will walk the long straight streets at evening, as the cooking smoke rises and the lamps are lit. And then, gently, we will watch the long ending come, not with fire and slaughter, not with an invading army at the gates, but with something slower and sadder. A changing climate, a dying river, and a great people quietly folding up their cities, one by one, and drifting away to begin again, elsewhere, carrying the memory of what they had been into the long silence of the centuries. It is a story with no conqueror and no king at its center. A story of clean water and quiet order, of a written language we cannot read and a people we cannot name, of one of the largest civilizations the ancient world ever produced, lost so completely and found again so recently that we are only now beginning to learn how to listen to it. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment and tell me the name of your town and what time it is where you are as you settle in. There is something quietly lovely in knowing that all around the world, others are lying in the dark, listening to this same old story under so many different skies. And if you find that these long, slow journeys through history help carry you down into sleep, you might think about subscribing, but only if they truly bring you rest. There is no need otherwise. Your peace tonight matters far more than any number. So there is nothing left to do now but let the day go. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the warmth settle into your hands and your jaw and the space behind your eyes. You do not have to remember any of this. You only have to listen and let the words carry you. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the room drift away. Feel the warm evening air coming off the great river, the smell of dust and wood smoke and cooking bread, the last light going soft and gold over the flat rooftops of a city that has been asleep for 4,000 years. We are going back now. Far back. Past Rome, past Egypt's greatest days, to the banks of a wide brown river at the very dawn of cities, to the first small farming villages, and the slow and patient beginning of the lost civilization of the Indus. Let us begin, as the story itself began, with the river. Picture a great water coming down out of high, snow-crowned mountains far to the north, gathering strength as it goes, until it flows out onto a vast and level plain, broad and brown and patient, winding its slow way across the land toward a distant sea. This is the Indus, and everything we will see tonight was born from its gift. For each year the river did a wonderful thing. Swollen by the melting mountain snows and the summer rains, it rose and spread across the flat land, laying down a fresh skin of dark, rich silt over the fields. Then it fell back within its banks, and left behind soil so fertile that a farmer had only to scatter seed upon it to bring forth wheat and barley in abundance. The river gave and the people lived. It was not one river alone, but many, a whole web of waters spreading across the plain, some great and some small, some that ran full all year and some that came and went with the seasons. Along their banks the land was green and generous. Away from them it faded quickly into dry scrub and desert. And so the life of this world clung close to the water, following the rivers like veins of green across a wide and thirsty land. It was a land of great skies and great distances. In the long summer the heat pressed down, fierce and heavy, until the very air seemed to shimmer above the fields. And then each year the monsoon would come, the great rains sweeping in from the sea, the sky darkening, the first heavy drops raising the smell of wet dust from the baked earth, and the whole parched land drinking deep and turning green again. The people learned to read this rhythm of flood and rain and dry season as surely as they read their own heartbeats. They knew when the waters would rise, and when to sow, and when to gather in the harvest before the river came again. Their whole lives turned upon the turning of the year, and upon the faithful, life-giving generosity of the rivers that ran through their world. And the land gave more than grain. In its rivers swam fish, in its reed beds nested birds, on its plains grazed cattle and buffalo and sheep. In the hills at the plain's edge lay stone and copper and precious things. And far off, beyond the deserts and across the sea, lay other lands with other treasures, timber and gold, tin and lapis lazuli, that a clever, trading people might one day reach out to gather. Here, then, was a cradle almost perfectly made for a great civilization to grow. A broad, fertile plain, watered by mighty rivers, warm enough for 2 harvests, rich in the raw stuff of craft and trade, and wide enough to hold not one city but dozens. All that was needed was a people patient and ingenious enough to master it. And such a people, slowly over long ages, were already taking shape. For human beings had lived in this land for a very long time before the great cities rose, first as wandering hunters, following the game and the seasons, and then, little by little, as settlers who had learned the deep magic of the seed and the flock. In small villages at the edge of the plain and up in the sheltering hills, they had begun the slow, patient work out of which all cities are, in the end, born. It is easy, standing amid the marvels of the finished civilization, to forget how long and how quietly the foundations were laid. No one decided one morning to build a city. It came instead through thousands of small ordinary choices made over thousands of years, a better way to store the grain, a stronger wall, a wider field, a longer journey to trade, each generation handing a little more knowledge to the next. So let us go back now, even before the brick cities and the straight streets, to those first small villages of mud and thatch on the edge of the Great Plain, to the patient farmers and herders and potters who never knew what they were beginning, and who laid, stone by stone and seed by seed, the deep foundations of the lost world of the Indus. Far to the west of the Great Plain, where the flatland rises toward the hills, lies a place that lets us glimpse the very beginning. Here, thousands of years before the great cities, stood one of the earliest farming villages in all of this part of the world. A small huddle of mud brick houses where people had already learned to grow wheat and barley, to herd sheep and goats and cattle, and to lay their dead to rest with small and careful gifts. Imagine that village in the soft light of an early morning long, long ago. Low houses of sun-dried brick, their walls smoothed by hand. Thin smoke rising from cooking fires. Women grinding grain between stones. Children driving the goats out toward the pasture. A potter shaping wet clay. The smell of bread and dung and dust. A small, quiet, self-contained world, and yet already carrying, in seed, everything that was to come. For in such villages, over many centuries, the people were quietly perfecting the arts on which all later greatness would rest. They learned to fire pottery hard and fine, and to paint it. They learned to work copper, hammering and then melting the bright metal into tools and ornaments. They learned to make small beads of stone and shell, drilling them with astonishing patience, and to trade them far beyond their own valley. And slowly, as the generations passed, the villages grew and multiplied, and spread out from the hills down onto the wide river plain itself. Wherever the water was good and the land was rich, new settlements took root. Fields widened. Herds grew. Granaries filled. And with the surplus of grain came something new and powerful: the ability to feed people who did not farm: potters, smiths, traders, builders, the first specialists, the first seeds of a town. Picture the plain now, no longer empty, but dotted with villages, their fields spreading along the rivers, their paths worn between them by the feet of traders and herders and kin. Goods began to flow: pottery from one place, copper from another, beautiful stone beads, seashells carried far inland, the bright blue lapis brought down from distant mountains. A whole network of exchange was quietly weaving these scattered settlements into something larger. And with trade came the need to keep track, to know how much grain, how many cattle, whose goods were whose. The people began to make small clay tokens and to press little carved stamps into soft clay, marking ownership and account. In these humble marks, made by farmers and traders going about their ordinary business, lay the distant first stirrings of the mysterious writing that would one day cover their seals. Certain settlements, better placed than others, at a river crossing, at a meeting of trade routes on especially rich land, began to grow faster than the rest. They drew in people and goods and skill. Their potters grew more expert, their traders more far-reaching, their buildings larger and more ordered. A village was becoming a town. A town would, in time, become a city. And then, over a span of just a few generations, a mere eye blink in the long, slow story we have been telling, something remarkable happened. Across the whole vast plain, almost as if by a shared and sudden inspiration, the scattered towns transformed. They began to build in a wholly new way, on a grand scale to a common plan, with a shared style of brick and craft and measure, stretching across hundreds of miles. No one commanded it as far as we can tell. No conquering king swept through and imposed it. It seems to have arisen, instead, from the deep and patient groundwork of all those centuries of villages, a civilization crystallizing, all at once, out of long readiness. The knowledge, the wealth, the trade, the skill had all been slowly gathering, and now, suddenly, they came together into something the world had never seen before. The age of the great cities had begun. And to the greatest of them we now will go, to the wide brick streets and the towering citadels of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, the twin wonders at the heart of the lost civilization, rising in their full and startling splendor from the dust of the river plain. Come, then, and let us approach one of the great cities for the first time, as a weary traveler of 4,000 years ago might have approached it, coming in across the flat plain at the end of a long day, and seeing, rising from the level land ahead, the unmistakable shape of something vast and made by human hands. First you would see it lifted above the plain, a great mound crowned with high walls of brick, standing tall over the flat country around it. This was the raised heart of the city, what we now call the citadel, not a fortress bristling with weapons as far as we can tell, but a great built-up platform carrying the city's most important structures, held up above the reach of the yearly floods. And spreading out below it, wide across the plain, lay the lower town, the great body of the city, where most of the people lived and worked. Street upon street of solid brick houses, blocks of them marching away in orderly rows, threaded with lanes and dotted with wells, and all of it laid out not in the tangled muddle of most ancient towns, but with a clear and deliberate order that is startling to behold. For this is the first thing that strikes everyone who comes to know these cities: their astonishing orderliness. The main streets run straight and broad, some wide enough for carts to pass, and they cross one another at right angles, dividing the city into great regular blocks. A grid planned and laid out from the beginning, as though someone had drawn the whole city on a board before ever a brick was set. Think how remarkable that is. To build a city to a plan means that someone at the very start decided where the streets would go and how wide and in what direction, and then that everyone for generations built within that plan. It speaks of a shared idea, a common understanding of how a city ought to be, held across a whole people and passed down the years. And the same plan appears in city after city, hundreds of miles apart. Two cities above all stand at the heart of this world. One lay to the north upon a tributary of the great river, a city we call Harappa, the first of these lost places to be uncovered, and so the one that gave its name to the whole civilization. The people themselves, of course, called it something else entirely. But that name, like so much else, is lost to us, and Harappa it has become. The other lay far to the south, down where the great river ran toward the sea, and this is the most famous and best preserved of them all. We call it Mohenjo-daro, a name that means, in a much later tongue, something like the Mound of the Dead. For when it was found, long after its people were gone, it was only a great silent hill of ruins, and no one knew its true name or the names of any who had ever lived there. These were not small places. Each of the great cities may have held tens of thousands of people within its walls, a huge population for that ancient age, rivaling the greatest cities of Egypt and Sumer. And they were only the largest of many. Across the vast territory of the civilization, spreading over an area larger than Western Europe, hundreds upon hundreds of towns and settlements shared the same remarkable way of life. Stand at the edge of such a city and simply take in its size and its order. The raised citadel against the sky, the wide grid of streets, the endless blocks of neat brick houses, the wells and the drains, the smoke of 1,000 hearths, the movement of a great and busy population going about its day, all of it planned, all of it built to a common measure, all of it clean and quiet and astonishingly modern to our eyes. And then remember the most haunting fact of all, that for all its size and order and evident wealth, this great city has left us no towering temple to overawe us, no vast palace, no giant statue of a god or king. Its grandeur is not the grandeur of power piled up in one place, but something stranger and gentler, the grandeur of an entire people living well, together in good and careful order. There is so much here to explore. Let us go in, then, through the wide brick streets and look closely at how these extraordinary cities were built, at the humble, perfect brick from which the whole marvel was raised, and at the quiet genius of order that shaped every street and every wall. The whole of this world was built of brick, and in the brick itself lies the first of its many quiet wonders. For the people of the Indus did not build, for the most part, with roughly shaped mud dried in the sun, as most of their neighbors did. They built on a vast scale, with brick baked hard in kilns until it was strong and lasting, millions upon millions of bricks, fired and stacked and set into the walls of their cities. And here is the marvel: those bricks were made to a standard. Not roughly, not by chance, but to a fixed and careful set of proportions, the same across the whole civilization. Wherever the archaeologists dig, in city after distant city, they find bricks cut to the very same ratio, as though a single rule for the making of a brick was known and honored across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. Pause on that, for it tells us something deep. To make every brick to the same proportion, across so wide a land and so long a time, means that these people shared not just a style but a system, an agreed measure, a common standard, carried in the minds and hands of countless separate brickmakers who never met. It is a small thing, a brick, and yet in its quiet regularity lies the signature of one of the most orderly civilizations the world has ever known. Watch in your mind how such a brick was made. The wet clay pressed firmly into a wooden mold, then turned out to dry, a neat rectangular block. Then, when enough had dried, they were stacked into a great kiln and fired with wood or dung until they rang hard and turned a deep, warm red. Rank upon rank of them, cooling in the sun, ready to be carried to the rising walls of the city. With these bricks the builders raised everything: the great platforms of the citadel, the walls of the houses, the linings of the wells, the steps and the drains. The work was solid and square and true. Walls were laid straight and thick, corners were clean, courses were even. There is a plainness to it and a rightness, the beauty not of ornament, but of a thing well and honestly made, exactly as it should be. And over the whole city lay that astonishing grid. The main streets ran straight, crossing at right angles, dividing the town into great rectangular blocks. Within each block, narrower lanes gave access to the houses. It was a hierarchy of ways, broad arteries and quiet side lanes, planned so that the life of a great crowded city could flow through it smoothly, and every home could be reached. The houses themselves turned their backs to the street. From the lane you would see mostly blank brick walls, plain and windowless, with a single doorway. But step through that door, and the house opened inward around a central courtyard, open to the sky, a private, sheltered heart to each home, cool and quiet, where the family's life was lived away from the dust and bustle of the public street. Many of the houses were substantial, 2 stories perhaps, with wooden stairs leading up, with several rooms about the courtyard, with a well of their own or one shared close by. And, most remarkably of all, with a bathing room and a drain to carry the water away. These were not the homes of a poor and struggling people. They were the comfortable, well-built houses of a prosperous and orderly society. And here is another quiet wonder. The houses are, for the most part, strikingly similar. There are larger ones and smaller ones, to be sure. But there is no towering mansion set among hovels, no single palace dwarfing all the rest. The comfort of the good brick house, with its courtyard and its clean water, seems to have been shared widely, the mark of a people among whom wealth and ease were spread, it appears, more evenly than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. Walk the streets in your imagination and feel how it must have been. The warm red brick on every side, the straight clean lanes, the ordered blocks, the wells at the corners, the doorways opening onto quiet inner courts. Solid, sensible, comfortable, unhurried. A city built not to awe the visitor or glorify a ruler, but simply to be lived in well by a great many people for a very long time. But of all the marvels of these brick cities, one stands above the rest, so far ahead of its age that it can still astonish us today. It is not a temple or a tomb or a treasure. It is something humbler, and in its way far more wonderful, the water. For the people of the Indus cared for water, and for cleanliness, with a genius and a devotion that the world would scarcely equal again for 4,000 years. Consider first the wells. All through the cities, at the corners of the streets and within the courtyards of the houses, the people sank wells, round shafts lined with specially shaped wedge of brick, going down to the water table below. In some cities there were hundreds of them, so that clean water was never far from any door. To draw water in Mohenjo-daro, you had only to walk a few steps down your own lane. Think what a gift that was. In most of the ancient world, and for most of human history since, fetching water was a long and heavy daily labor, hauled from a distant river or a single-town well. But here, clean water welled up at the heart of the neighborhood, and even within the home. A quiet, everyday abundance, so ordinary to the people who enjoyed it that they can hardly have known how rare and precious a thing they had made. And then, more astonishing still, consider what they did with the water once it was used. For in house after house, the archaeologists have found a small room floored with fine, tight-fitted brick gently sloped, a bathing room where a person might stand and pour water over themselves and be clean. A private bathroom in an ordinary family home 5,000 years ago. It is almost impossible to overstate how far ahead of its time this was. But the true wonder is where the water went. For each bathing room, each household drain was connected, led out through the wall in a covered brick channel into a larger drain running beneath the street. The waste water of the whole city was gathered, quietly, out of sight, and carried away. Beneath those clean straight streets ran a hidden network of sewers, planned and built as carefully as the streets above. Walk one of those streets and look down, and you would see, running along its edge, a channel of brick, covered over with fitted slabs or bricks that could be lifted for cleaning. Into it, from every house, ran the smaller household drains. At intervals there were basins to catch the solid waste, so that it could be removed and the channels kept flowing. It was a true sanitation system, and there would not be another like it for thousands of years. Let that thought settle. The great cities of Rome, 2,500 years later, would be justly famous for their drains and their baths. But here, in the cities of the Indus, long before Rome was even a village, ordinary people were already living with covered sewers and private bathrooms and clean well water at their doors. Their neighbors in the great cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt had nothing to remotely match it. And this, perhaps more than anything else, tells us what kind of people they were. Pyramids and palaces are built to glorify the few. But a citywide system of drains and wells and bathrooms is built to serve the many, quietly, invisibly, for the daily comfort and health of ordinary families. It speaks not of the pride of a ruler, but of a deep, shared, practical care for the common good. There is something almost moving in it. No name is attached to these drains. No king boasts of them on any monument. They were simply built and maintained and repaired generation after generation by a people who seem to have decided, together and without fanfare, that a city ought to be clean and its people comfortable and its water good. It is a very humble kind of greatness and a very rare one. Imagine the city working in the cool of an evening, the water drawn up cool and clean from the courtyard wells, the households washing away the dust of the day, the used water running quietly out beneath the streets and away. The air, for all the crowding of a great town, kept fresher and cleaner than in almost any city that would come after for millennia. Order and comfort and quiet care, running like clear water through everything. And at the very summit of this devotion to water stood one structure above all, the single most famous thing that survives from the whole lost civilization. High on the citadel of Mohenjo-daro, they built a great pool of fitted brick, sunk into the ground and made watertight with astonishing care. A place, it seems, not merely for washing, but for something deeper. We call it the Great Bath. And it is there, on the high heart of the city, that we will go next. Climb with me now up onto the citadel of Mohenjo-daro, the great raised mound at the city's heart, lifted high above the plain and the streets below. Here stood the buildings that mattered most to these people, whatever they were: great halls, a huge structure that may have been a granary, and, above all, the strange and beautiful thing we have come to call the Great Bath. Picture it. A large rectangular pool, sunk into the ground, perhaps 12 meters long and a couple of deep. Not vast, but generous, and made with breathtaking care. Broad steps lead down into it at either end, as if inviting you to descend into the water. All around it runs a paved walkway, and beyond that, rooms and a pillared court. It is the oldest such public pool known anywhere in the world. And the making of it is a marvel of quiet skill. To hold water, the builders laid the bricks of the pool on edge, set in a mortar of gypsum plaster, and then, most cleverly of all, lined the whole basin with a thick layer of black, water-resistant bitumen, a natural tar, sealing it tight. Behind the brick they packed more of the same. For 1,000 years on, we can still see how they made it hold its water. A great well stood nearby to fill it, and a drain, carefully built, could empty it again, so that the water could be changed and kept fresh. Everything about it speaks of deliberate, thoughtful design. The steps for entering, the ledge for sitting, the surrounding rooms for who knows what preparation or rest. This was no casual puddle. It was a cherished and central thing, built to last and built to matter. But here we meet the deep silence at the heart of this civilization. For we do not know, we cannot know what the Great Bath was truly for. The people left us no writing we can read to explain it. We can only stand at its edge and look at the water-stained brick and wonder. Perhaps it was a place of ritual cleansing, of washing the body to purify the spirit, as so many later faiths of this same land would come to hold sacred. Perhaps priests, or the leaders of the city, descended those steps at appointed times, in some ceremony whose meaning is utterly lost. The care lavished upon it, and its place high on the citadel above the city, suggests something more than ordinary bathing, something held to be important, even holy. Or perhaps it was simpler and grander than that. A great public amenity, a place for the people of the city to gather and to bathe, in the same practical spirit that gave every house its private washing room and filled every street with clean water. We do not know. We are left only with the beautiful, watertight, silent pool, and the questions it will not answer. And that, in a way, is the whole experience of this lost world in miniature. Here is a thing made with enormous skill and evident meaning, standing at the very center of a great city, and we can admire its craft and measure its bricks and marvel at its age, but we cannot cross the last small distance into the minds of the people who made it. Their intention floats forever just beyond our reach. Sit a while at the edge of the Great Bath in your imagination, in the quiet of an evening on the high citadel, the city spread out below. Whatever it was for, people once came here who loved this place and tended it and found in it something worth all that care. Their feet wore these steps. Their hands sealed this brick. And the still water, if it could speak, would tell us everything we long to know. But it keeps its silence. And so we come down again from the citadel into the streets of the living city, and to a mystery even deeper than the bath. For as we walk these ordered streets, searching for the mark of the ruler who commanded it all, we find ourselves facing the strangest question of the whole Indus world. Where, in all this vast and careful civilization, is the king? In every other great civilization of the ancient world, the ruler is impossible to miss. In Egypt, the pharaoh raised mountains of stone to house his body and covered the temple walls with his image. In Sumer and Babylon, kings built towering ziggurats and palaces and set down their laws and their conquests in writing for all time. Power announced itself, loudly, in stone and gold. It is the loudest voice in the ancient record. But walk through the cities of the Indus, and that voice falls silent. Search as we may, we find no great royal palace towering over the rest. We find no royal tombs heaped with treasure. We find no colossal statue of a god-king, no triumphant carving of a ruler crushing his enemies, no monument raised by a proud sovereign to blazon his own name down the ages. In all this vast civilization, the king is simply missing. It is one of the great puzzles of archaeology. How was such a world governed? For governed it surely was. Someone somehow ensured that every brick was made to the same measure, that the streets ran straight, that the drains were built and maintained, that the weights were exact, that trade flowed and cities rose to a common plan across hundreds of miles. That kind of deep, shared order does not simply happen. And yet it left almost no trace of the hand that shaped it. Perhaps the rulers of the Indus were priests, whose authority was sacred rather than military, and who did not glorify themselves in stone. Perhaps power was shared among councils of leading families, or merchants, or the elders of the great cities, so that no single figure ever rose high enough to loom over all the rest. Perhaps it was held together less by force than by custom, by a way of life so deeply agreed upon that it hardly needed a throne at all. We simply do not know. But the absence itself is eloquent. A civilization that built no palaces and raised no royal monuments and left no boasting inscriptions was a civilization whose values were, in some deep way, different from almost every other of its age. It poured its genius not into glorifying the few, but into the shared, practical fabric of ordinary life, the streets, the drains, the wells, the well-built homes. And there is another silence that goes with it, and it is just as striking: the silence of war. In the remains of these cities, we find remarkably little sign of fighting. Few weapons of war. Few defenses built against a human enemy. The great walls seem raised more against floods than armies. No burned and slaughtered cities, no mass graves of the fallen, no monuments to conquest. For 1,000 years, across a vast land, this civilization seems to have lived in a deep and unusual peace. Think how rare that is in the human story. The history we are usually taught is a history of battles and conquests, of empires rising on the ruin of their neighbors. But here is a great civilization, as large and as advanced as any of its time, that seems to have built its cities not for war but for living, and to have kept them generation upon generation in quiet order and unusual peace. It is almost a different vision of what a civilization could be. No king to obey, no god-king to fear, no great army marching, no monuments to power or conquest. Instead, clean water, straight streets, comfortable homes, exact weights, far-reaching trade, and 1,000 years of peace. Whatever held this world together, it was something gentler and more mysterious than the mailed fist that ruled most of the ancient earth. Of course, we must be careful. Absence of evidence is a slippery thing. Perhaps their kings and their wars have simply not survived, or lie still buried, or were written only in the words we cannot read. But taken all together, the missing palaces, the missing royal tombs, the missing monuments, the scarcity of weapons, the picture is remarkably consistent. This was a world that did its greatness quietly. And perhaps that quietness is part of why it was so utterly forgotten. A civilization that raises no pyramids and carves no boasts leaves less for later ages to stumble upon and remember. It does not shout down the centuries. It whispers. And its whisper was lost for 4,000 years until the patient work of archaeology learned, at last, to hear it. But let us turn now from these great questions to the small and human things, to the ordinary people who filled these ordered streets and lived these comfortable lives and left in the everyday stuff of their days the warmest and most touching traces of all. Let us go gently into the life of a household in the lost cities of the Indus. Step through the plain doorway of a house, out of the busy lane, and into the quiet courtyard at its heart. Open to the sky, it is the center of the family's world. Here the cooking fire burns. Here the grain is ground. Here the children play and the old ones sit in the shade of the wall. Rooms open off it on every side, and a stair, perhaps, climbs to an upper floor and a flat roof where the family might sleep on the hottest nights. The daily bread of this world was grain, wheat and barley, grown in the rich river fields, harvested and stored and ground each day into flour. Picture a woman kneeling at a saddle-shaped grinding stone, rocking a smaller stone back and forth over the golden grain, the flour gathering at the edge, then the flat dough baking on a hot hearth, and the warm smell of it filling the courtyard. This was the taste and smell of every ordinary day. But their table held far more than bread. They kept cattle and buffalo, sheep and goats, and ate their meat and drank their milk. They fished the rivers. They grew peas and pulses, dates and melons and other fruits. And they grew something that would one day clothe half the world: cotton. For it was here, in the fields of the Indus, that human beings first learned to cultivate the cotton plant and spin its soft white fiber into thread. Imagine the wonder of that, though to them it was only ordinary work. Taking the fluffy white bolls from the plant, cleaning and combing them and spinning them on a simple weighted spindle into fine cotton thread, then weaving that thread into light, cool, washable cloth perfect for their hot land. The people of the Indus wore cotton thousands of years before the rest of the world, and traded it, too, to their neighbors far away. Their homes were furnished simply and well. Pottery of every kind, great storage jars for grain and water, cooking pots, fine painted dishes, little cups. Tools of copper and bronze and stone. Beds and stools of wood, long since crumbled to dust. Toys for the children, and here the lost people reach out and touch us most directly of all, for they left behind whole troops of little clay toys. There are small clay carts with wheels that turn, and little clay oxen to pull them, and figures of people and animals. There are whistles shaped like birds and rattles and dice for games. There is even, from one city, a small clay monkey that could once slide down a string. For 1,000 years ago, a child in Mohenjo-daro played on the courtyard floor with a toy cart, and we, holding it now, feel the centuries fall away. The women and men of the Indus loved to adorn themselves, too. They wore bangles, many, many bangles of shell, of copper, of colored stone, of fired clay, stacked up the arm. They wore necklaces of beautiful beads and earrings and rings. They dressed their hair with care. In their love of ornament, in their small vanities and pleasures, they are utterly, warmly human and utterly familiar. Out in the streets, the city hummed with work. Potters at their wheels, coppersmiths at their small roaring furnaces, beadmakers bent over their endless patient drilling, weavers at their looms, traders weighing goods on their exact little scales, farmers bringing grain in from the fields, water carriers and sweepers and porters, and children running everywhere underfoot. A great, busy, ordered, ordinary human city, alive with the work of tens of thousands of hands. And when the work was done, and the fierce sun began to soften toward evening, the pace would ease. The animals were brought in. The cooking fires were lit across the whole city, and the smoke rose blue into the golden light. Families gathered in their courtyards to eat the evening meal. The sound of talk and laughter and the crying of children drifted over the flat rooftops. As the dark came on, small oil lamps were lit within the houses, glowing warm in the doorways and the courtyards. The great grid of streets grew quiet. On the flat roofs, in the hot season, people spread their beds beneath the enormous starry sky of the plain. And slowly the huge city, for all its tens of thousands of souls, settled street by street and house by house into sleep. This, then, was the daily life of the lost civilization. Modest, comfortable, industrious, clean, and deeply recognizably human. And these same ordinary hands, in their workshops and their courtyards, made things of such beauty and such skill that they can still take our breath away. To the art and craft of the Indus, to its beads and its bronzes and its haunting little sculptures, we now will turn. For all their plainness of building, the people of the Indus had a deep love of small and beautiful things, and a mastery in making them that still astonishes the experts today. Nowhere is this clearer than in their beads, for these people were, above all, among the greatest beadmakers the ancient world ever produced. They made beads of every kind, of gold and copper, of shell and clay, and above all of beautiful colored stones, banded agate, deep red carnelian, blue-green turquoise, and others carried from far away. And they shaped them and polished them, and above all drilled them with a patience and precision that seems almost impossible. Some of their long carnelian beads are pierced end to end with a hole so fine and so straight it defies belief. To drill such a bead, they invented special hard stone drills and turned them, for hour upon hour upon hour, boring slowly through the stubborn stone. A single long bead might take days of patient labor. And they made them by the thousand, and strung them into necklaces and belts and ornaments of great beauty, and traded them, prized and sought after, to the distant cities of Mesopotamia, where Indus beads have been found in the graves of kings. And there was one bright, secret art at which they seem to have been the masters of the whole ancient world, the making of carnelian beads etched with pale white patterns. By a clever chemical trick, using a paste and heat, they could draw permanent white designs onto the deep red stone. It was a difficult and closely held craft, and their etched carnelian beads traveled far and wide, little glowing tokens of Indus skill carried across the ancient world. They worked metal, too, with great skill. Copper and bronze, hammered and cast into tools and vessels and ornaments. And in bronze they left us one small figure that has become, perhaps, the most beloved image of the whole civilization. A little statuette only a few inches high of a young woman standing utterly at her ease. We call her the dancing girl. She stands with one hand on her hip and her long legs slightly crossed, her head tilted back, her whole slender body relaxed and confident and full of life. Her arm is stacked from wrist to shoulder with bangles. There is nothing stiff or formal about her. She seems caught in a living moment, a real girl, poised and self-possessed, 4,500 years ago, and cast, astonishingly, in bronze by the difficult lost wax method. To look at her is to feel, again, that strange closeness across the abyss of time. She is not a goddess or a queen enthroned in majesty. She is a young person, at ease in her own body, adorned and alive, and someone long ago saw that particular human beauty clearly enough and loved it enough to fix it forever in bronze. She has been standing in that easy pose for 45 centuries, and she has not aged a day. There is another famous figure, carved this time in soft stone. The head and shoulders of a bearded man, his eyes half closed as if in deep thought or meditation, a band around his brow, his robe drawn over one shoulder and patterned with trefoils. We call him the Priest King, though in truth we have no idea whether he was a priest or a king or a god or simply a dignified elder. The name is only our guess, hung upon a silent face. And how eloquent that silent, half-closed gaze is. He looks inward, calm and grave, holding some thought we shall never know. He is the closest thing we have to a portrait of a leader of this world, and yet he tells us nothing, names no one, claims no throne. He simply meditates, forever, on the far side of a silence we cannot cross. In him, all the grave mystery of the Indus seems gathered into a single quiet face. They made fine pottery too, turned on the wheel and painted in black on a red ground with graceful designs. Leaves and fish and interlocking circles, peacocks and people leaves and running spirals. They made countless little figurines of clay, mother figures heavy with ornament, and animals of every kind, cattle and rams and comical humped bulls, shaped with a quick and loving hand. In all of it, the glowing beads, the easy bronze girl, the meditating stone face, the painted pots and the little clay beasts, we meet a people of real refinement and warmth, who loved beauty in small and human things and made them with matchless skill. And on their most beautiful objects of all, the little carved seals, they left us the one thing we most long to read, and cannot, their writing. To the seals and to the great enigma of the Indus script we turn next. Of all the countless things the people of the Indus made and left behind, none is more beautiful, more haunting, or more important than the little carved seals. There are thousands of them, scattered through the ruined cities, and each one is a small masterpiece, and each one carries, along its top, a line of the writing we cannot read. Picture one in the palm of your hand. It is small, perhaps an inch or two square, carved from a soft gray-white stone called steatite and then fired hard and pale. On its face, cut in delicate low relief, is an animal rendered with wonderful life and skill. And above the animal march a few elegant little signs, the mysterious script. On the back is a small pierced boss, so the seal could be strung on a cord and carried or worn. These seals were tools of trade and ownership. Pressed into a lump of soft clay, the seal left its raised image and its line of signs behind, sealing a bundle of goods, marking a jar, closing a package, saying, in some way we can no longer read, this belongs to, or this is guaranteed by, or this passed through the hands of. Small clay sealings, stamped and hardened, have been found where goods were stored and shipped. But it is the animals upon them that catch the eye and hold it. The humped Indian bull, or zebu, stands proud and heavy-shouldered. The mighty water buffalo lowers its great sweep of horns. There are elephants and rhinoceroses and tigers and crocodiles, the whole rich wildlife of that ancient land, observed with a keen and loving eye and carved with breathtaking naturalism. And then there is the strangest and most famous of them all, a creature that appears on more seals than any other, and yet is like no animal that ever lived. It has the body of a bull or an antelope, held in delicate profile, and rising from its brow, a single long, straight, spiraled horn. We call it, inevitably, the unicorn of the Indus. What was it? We do not know. Perhaps it was a real animal shown always in profile so that its two horns appeared as one. Perhaps it was a mythical beast, sacred and powerful, the emblem of some great clan or guild or belief. Before it, on many seals, stands a curious object, a kind of stand or manger or ritual vessel, whose meaning is, like everything else, lost. The one-horned creature gazes out at us across 4,000 years, beautiful and unexplained. There is one seal, stranger still, that has fascinated everyone who has seen it. Upon it sits a figure cross-legged, in what looks unmistakably like a posture of yoga or meditation. Upon his head is a great horned headdress. And around him on every side are wild animals, a tiger, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a buffalo. Some have called him a lord of the beasts. Some have seen in him a distant ancestor of a great god of later India. Is he a god? A shaman? A vision of some forgotten faith? Again, we cannot know. But that seated, meditating, horned figure surrounded by beasts is one of the most tantalizing images from the whole ancient world. A possible glimpse into the spiritual life of the Indus, and a possible thread reaching forward, across thousands of years, into beliefs still living today. And yet the thread dissolves, as always, into silence. The seals were made with real artistry and real care, by craftsmen who clearly took pride in them. The animals are alive. The little signs are cut cleanly and confidently. The whole small object has a jewel-like perfection. Whoever owns such a seal owns something precious and personal, a mark that was theirs, a token of their place in the great web of the city's life and trade. And they carried these seals far. Indus seals and clay ceilings stamped by them have turned up not only across the whole vast territory of the civilization, but far away, in the cities of Mesopotamia, in the ports of the Persian Gulf, carried there by traders, dropped and lost and buried, little messengers of the Indus scattered across the ancient world, waiting 4,000 years to be found. But whenever we pick one up and turn it over and admire the proud bull or the strange unicorn, our eye rises always to that line of little signs along the top, and there we run every time into the great wall of silence that stands at the very heart of this civilization. For those signs are writing, and no one in all the world has ever been able to read them. Here we come to the deepest mystery of all, the one that sets the Indus apart from every other great literate civilization of the ancient world. For Egypt gave up its secrets when the hieroglyphs were deciphered. Mesopotamia speaks to us clearly through its cuneiform. Even long-dead languages have, one by one, been made to yield. But the script of the Indus has kept its silence, unbroken, to this very day. We have plenty of it. There are thousands of examples, on the seals, on little tablets, on pottery, on tools scratched and stamped and carved. The signs themselves have been carefully catalogued. Several hundred distinct symbols, some clearly pictures of things, fish and arrows and human figures, others abstract marks. It is unmistakably a system of writing, made by a literate people, used across their whole world for many centuries. And yet no one can read a word of it. Scholars have labored over it for 100 years. Codes far more obscure have been cracked. Lost languages far more distant have been recovered. But the Indus script has defeated every attempt, and the reasons why it is so stubborn tell us something about the strange, quiet nature of this civilization itself. The first great difficulty is the shortness of the texts. The inscriptions we have are tiny, on average only a handful of signs. The longest is little more than a couple of dozen. There are no long inscriptions, no royal proclamations carved on walls, no clay libraries of tablets, no epics, no chronicles, no laws set down at length. It is as though this people wrote only in brief labels and tags, and from such short scraps, a lost script is desperately hard to crack. The second great difficulty is that we do not know their language. When the Egyptian hieroglyphs were deciphered, scholars had a crucial help. They knew the descendant tongue, and they had the same text written in a known language alongside. But for the Indus, we have no such key. We do not know what family their language belonged to, and we have no ancient translation, no bilingual text, nothing to unlock the signs. So the script sits before us, plain and patient and utterly closed. We can see the signs clearly. We can count how often each appears. We can notice which tend to come at the beginning of a text and which at the end, hints that it may run from right to left. We can tell, in short, that it is real writing, obeying real rules. But what those signs sounded like, and what they meant, we cannot say. Think of what is locked away behind that silence. The name this people called themselves. The names of their cities and their rivers, their gods and their leaders. their prayers if they prayed, their stories if they told them, the meaning of the great bath and the unicorn and the horned meditating figure. All of it may be written right there on the little seals in our museum cases, and we cannot read a single word. There is a particular kind of ache in that. To have the writing and not the reading. To hold in your hand a message deliberately made by another human being to carry meaning, and to be locked out of that meaning forever by the simple loss of a key. Every other great early civilization eventually found its voice again. The Indus alone still cannot speak to us, though it is clearly, patiently trying. Perhaps one day the silence will break. Perhaps a long inscription will be found, or a bilingual text, some Indus message written also in a language we know, and suddenly the seals will speak, and this whole lost world will come flooding into words. Scholars still hope, and still labor, and every new tablet from the ground is studied with a quickening heart. Or perhaps it never will. Perhaps the texts are simply too short, the language too utterly lost, and the Indus is destined to remain, forever, the great civilization we can see but cannot hear, known to us entirely through its things, its bricks and drains and beads and bones, and never through its own words. Either way, there is a strange dignity in that silence. This quiet people, who raised no boastful monuments and carved no bragging inscriptions, kept even their written words modest and small, and so kept, without ever meaning to, the deepest secrets of who they were. And in the very things they made with such care and such precision, we can read at least the shape of their minds, for these were people who loved order and measure and getting things exactly right. If there is one quality that shines through everything the people of the Indus made, from their bricks to their beads to their cities, it is precision, a deep, patient love of measure and standard and order. And nowhere is this clearer or more beautiful than in the little objects they used to weigh their goods. For among the ruins, in city after city, the archaeologists keep finding small, neat cubes of polished stone. They are weights the traders used upon their balances. And when you gather them together and set them on a modern scale, an astonishing thing appears. They follow a single, exact, shared system, the same across the whole vast civilization. The weights climb in a careful sequence, each a fixed multiple of the last, doubling and doubling through the smaller sizes, then rising in larger steps for the heavier ones. And this same system, these same ratios, appear everywhere the Indus people lived, over hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. A weight from a northern city will balance true against a weight from a southern one. It is one of the most precise and consistent systems of measurement in the entire ancient world. Hold one of those little stone cubes in your mind, cut and polished so exactly so many centuries ago. It seems a humble thing, but it carries a profound message. It means that a farmer selling grain in one city and a merchant buying beads in another far away could trust that a given weight meant the same thing in both places. It means fairness and reliability and a shared trust stretched across a whole civilization. For that, in the end, is what a standard is, a form of trust made solid. When everyone agrees that a brick shall have these proportions, and a weight shall have this mass, and a city shall be laid out on this plan, then strangers who will never meet can nonetheless deal fairly with one another, and rely upon one another across great distances and long years. The exact little weights of the Indus are quietly monuments to trust. And this same ordered mind shows everywhere once you begin to look for it. In the bricks, all cut to the same proportion. In the streets, all laid to the same grid. In the drains, all built to carry the water away. In the seals, all made to the same small perfect standard. This was a people who found, in order and measure and precision, something like a guiding principle, perhaps even something sacred. They seemed to have measured length, too, with the same care, using a standard unit that appears again and again in the dimensions of their buildings. Some scholars believe they can trace a shared ruler, a common yardstick, running through the architecture of the whole civilization. Whether or not every claim holds, the overall picture is unmistakable. These were master measurers, in love with getting the world exactly, quietly, reliably right. There is something deeply appealing in this, something that speaks across the ages to anyone who has ever loved a thing done neatly and well. No grand boast, no towering monument, just the quiet satisfaction of the true corner, the exact weight, the straight street, the fair measure. The greatness of the Indus is, again and again, this humble, patient, unshowy perfection. And this same precision was the secret engine of their wealth. For a people whose weights were exact and whose standards were trusted were a people others were glad to trade with. When you buy from a merchant whose measure you can rely on, you come back and you bring others. The ordered honesty of the Indus was not only beautiful, it was, in the most practical way, good for business. And business, for these people, reached far indeed. Their traders were not content with the great river plain alone. They pushed outward, across the deserts and the mountains and the sea, carrying the goods and the beads and the precise measures of the Indus to the ends of the known world, and reaching, at last, the great and glittering cities of Mesopotamia. To follow those traders out into the wider world, we go next. The people of the Indus were, from the very beginning, a trading people, and the reach of their commerce is one of the marvels of their world. They gathered raw materials from an enormous span of country, and they sent their finished goods out along the roads and rivers and sea lanes of the ancient world, far beyond their own borders. Think of all that flowed into their cities. Copper from the hills and from distant lands. Gold and silver. Tin, precious and far carried, to mix with copper into bronze. Timber floated down the rivers from the mountain forests. Shells from the far-off seashore carried deep inland. Semi-precious stones of every color gathered from scattered and distant sources. And, most prized of all, the deep blue lapis lazuli, which came from a single remote region of mountains, immensely far away. To gather all this, the Indus traders ranged over an astonishing distance, into the highlands to the west, up into the mountains to the north, along the coasts, and out among the peoples of the deserts and hills who mined the metals and the stones. Trading posts and outlying settlements marked their reach, little Indus footholds planted far from the great cities, at the sources of the things they needed. And they were sailors, too. Down where the great river met the sea, they built ports, and from these they sent their ships out along the coast and across the Gulf, riding the seasonal winds, carrying the goods of the Indus westward, toward the mouths of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the wealthy cities of Sumer and Akkad that stood upon them. For the two great civilizations knew each other. In the records of Mesopotamia, written in a script we can read, there are mentions of a distant land they called Meluha, a far country of traders across the sea, from which came carnelian and precious woods, gold and copper, and wonderfully exotic animals. And most scholars are confident that this Meluha, this rich and half-legendary trading land beyond the sea, was the civilization of the Indus. Imagine an Indus merchant, 4,000 years ago, standing in the harbor of a great Mesopotamian city, so very far from home, the strange language in his ears, the towering mud-brick temple tower of the ziggurat rising over the rooftops, so unlike his own low, orderly, kingless cities. He has come across desert and sea to trade the treasures of his homeland, and he is known here and welcomed, a merchant of distant Meluha. And we know he was there because he left his things behind. In the ruins of Mesopotamia, the archaeologists have found Indus seals, and Indus-etched carnelian beads, and Indus weights, and Indus pottery. Some Indus people seem even to have settled in the Mesopotamian cities, a little community of merchants from the eastern land, living far from home among a foreign people. The threads of trade wove the two great worlds together. Picture the ships setting out from the Indus ports, laden with their cargo, beads and cotton cloth, carnelian and copper, ivory and precious woods, perhaps even peacocks and other wonders of their land. Picture them riding the winds down the coast and across the Gulf, and coming home again months later with tin and silver and the goods of the West. It was a commerce that spanned the known world, run with the same quiet competence as everything else these people did. And it made them rich, not with the piled-up treasure of kings, but with the broad, shared prosperity we have seen in their comfortable homes and their clean streets and their countless ornaments. The wealth of the Indus was the wealth of a trading people, spread wide through a great and busy society, flowing in along the sea lanes and the mountain roads from half the ancient world. So they were far from isolated, these quiet people of the river plain. Their reach was vast, their goods were prized, their traders were known in the greatest cities of their age. And yet, for all their connection to the wider world, they kept their own strange and gentle character, kingless, peaceful, orderly, and clean. Let us return now, from the far ports and the foreign cities, to the heart of that world, and spend a single ordinary day within the walls of Mohenjo-daro itself. Let us wake the greatest of the cities now, and walk its streets through a single ordinary day at the height of its glory. The dawn comes soft and gray over the flat plain, and then the sun lifts above the eastern horizon and spills its light across the city, catching first the high walls of the citadel, then flowing down over the great grid of streets and the flat rooftops of the sleeping town. The city stirs. On the rooftops, where people slept in the warm night, they rise and stretch and climb down into their courtyards. Cooking fires are kindled. The smoke rises blue across the whole town. At the wells, the first water is drawn up cool for the day. And out through the city gates, herders drive the cattle and the buffalo toward the pastures by the river, their hooves soft in the dust of the early light. The streets fill with the business of the morning. Water carriers and sweepers, farmers bringing in grain and vegetables from the fields, traders opening their goods. Down the broad main streets and along the narrow lanes flows the ordinary traffic of a great city, foot and cart and pack animal, past the blank outer walls of the courtyard houses, each turned quietly inward upon its own family life. In the workshops, the crafts of the city come to life. The potter's wheel spins, and the wet clay rises under his hands. The coppersmith's small furnace glows, and his hammer rings. The beadmaker bends to his endless patient drilling, boring his fine straight holes through the stubborn red carnelian. The weaver works her loom. The seal cutter carves his proud little bull. A great city's worth of skilled and busy hands. Somewhere, goods are being weighed and traded, the exact little stone cubes set upon the balance, the deal struck fairly and closed with the press of a seal into soft clay. Grain moves from the great storehouses. Bundles are made ready for the long journeys to the ports and the distant lands. The quiet machinery of the Indus economy turns, all through the morning, smooth and ordered and sure. Through the heat of the midday, the pace slows. People withdraw into the cool shade of their courtyards and the shadowed rooms behind the thick brick walls. The streets empty. The city drowses under the high, hard sun. Only the water, drawn cool from the deep wells, gives relief, and high on the citadel, the still surface of the great bath lies waiting, whatever it was for in the shimmering heat. Then, as the sun begins its long slide toward the west and the fierce heat softens, the city wakes again. The workshops resume. The streets refill. The herds come home from the pastures in a cloud of golden dust, lowing, driven back in through the gates as the light turns amber. The day's work draws toward its close, and the whole town turns its thoughts toward the evening meal and the coming rest. The cooking fires are lit again across the city, and the smell of baking bread and simmering food drifts through the lanes. Families gather in their courtyards. The grain is ground. The flat bread bakes on the hearth. There is talk and the crying and laughter of children, and the small, comfortable sounds of a great many households settling into the evening, all across the vast grid of the town. The light goes from gold to rose to deepening blue. High above, the first stars prick out in the enormous sky of the plain. Within the houses, small oil lamps are lit, glowing warm in the doorways and the courtyards. And a great quiet begins to spread through the city, street by street, as the day's business ends and the long warm night comes down. On the flat rooftops, in the heat of the season, the people carry up their beds and lie down beneath the open sky, under that vast and brilliant field of stars, with the warm air moving softly over them and the murmur of the great sleeping city all around. Below them, the streets lie empty and clean. The water runs quietly away beneath them. The wells stand full and cool at every corner. And so the city sleeps, tens of thousands of souls, in their ordered streets and their comfortable homes, beneath the same wide stars that shine down on you tonight. It is a peaceful thing to imagine. No army at the gates, no tyrant to fear, only a great clean quiet city at rest by its river, breathing softly in the dark. But before we leave the living city, let us ask what these sleeping people believed and search gently for their gods. What did the people of the Indus believe? What gods did they honor? What did they hope and fear and pray for in the night? Here, as so often, we stand before a locked door, for without their words, we can only gather up the scattered clues they left and guess. And yet those clues, though they cannot give us certainty, give us tantalizing glimpses of a rich inner world. The first great clue is, once again, an absence. Just as we found no palaces and no kings, so we find no great temples, no towering house of a god to dominate the city, as the ziggurat dominated the cities of Mesopotamia. Whatever the faith of the Indus was, it did not build itself vast and central and unmistakable in stone. Like so much in this world, it was quieter and more diffuse and harder to see. And yet the signs of the sacred are everywhere once you look. There are the countless little figurines of clay, and among them, again and again, the figure of a woman, heavy with necklaces and ornament, her form emphasized. Many scholars believe these are images of a great mother goddess, a deity of fertility and life and the generous earth, worshipped perhaps in the home, in small private acts of devotion, rather than in any grand public temple. Then there is that haunting seal we saw before, the figure seated cross-legged in the posture of meditation, crowned with great horns, surrounded by wild beasts. If he is a god, and he may be, then he is a god of a very particular kind, a lord of the animals, a master of the wild, sitting in what looks for all the world like the posture of a yogi. And in him some have seen the distant seed of a great god of later India, and the ancient roots of the practice of yoga itself. There is the peepal tree, the sacred fig, which appears again and again on the seals, a tree still held holy in the same land thousands of years later. There are figures that seem to stand within its branches, as if a spirit dwelt in the tree. There are strange scenes of ritual, of worship, of processions, half glimpsed on the little seals, whose full meaning is utterly beyond us, fragments of ceremonies whose music we shall never hear. And there is water. Everywhere in this civilization, there is the loving care of water, the wells, the bathrooms, the drains, and above all the great bath, that vast and cherished pool high on the citadel. It is hard not to feel that for these people water was more than a convenience, that washing was more than washing, that cleanliness itself had, perhaps, a sacred dimension, a purity of the body reaching toward a purity of the spirit, as it would in the faiths of that same land for millennia to come. For that is the most tantalizing possibility of all, that the beliefs of the Indus did not simply vanish when the cities fell, but flowed on, changed and hidden, into the great religious traditions that would later rise in the same land. the reverence for bathing and pure water, the seated, meditating, animal-lorded figure, the sacred people tree, the mother goddess of the fertile earth. All of these have their echoes, faint but real, in the living faiths of India today. If that is so, then this lost people are not so wholly lost after all. Something of what they held holy may still be alive, for 1,000 years later, in the daily devotions and the deep habits of hundreds of millions of people who have never heard their name, a hidden inheritance, passed silently down the long generations from the kingless cities by the river. But we must hold all this lightly, for it is guesswork built upon silence. We do not truly know what the mother figures meant, or who the horned god was, or what the Great Bath was for, or whether the threads to later India are real or only our own hopeful pattern-making. The honest answer, once again, is that we stand before a people whose hearts we cannot read, and can only wonder at the beautiful, broken clues they left. Whatever they believed, it seems to have been woven quietly through the fabric of ordinary life, in the home, in the bath, in the little clay figure and the carved seal and the sacred tree, rather than piled up in one great temple for all to see. A gentle, domestic, everywhere and nowhere faith, as quiet and as pervasive and as hard to grasp as everything else about this most private of civilizations. Let us widen our view now from the single city to the astonishing extent of their whole world. We have spent our time in the two greatest cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. But it would be a mistake to imagine that these were the whole of the Indus world. They were only the largest jewels in a crown that stretched across an almost unimaginable span of country, the greatest civilization in sheer extent of its entire age. Think of the size of it. The territory of the Indus spread across an area larger than Western Europe, larger than the domains of Egypt and Mesopotamia put together. Across all that vast land, from the mountains to the sea, from the western hills to the eastern rivers, the same remarkable civilization held sway. The same bricks, the same weights, the same seals, the same script, the same clean and ordered way of life. And it was dotted everywhere with settlements. Not just the two great cities, but a whole hierarchy of them. Other large towns and smaller towns and hundreds upon hundreds of villages, all sharing in the common culture. More than 1,000 Indus sites have now been found, and more are discovered still. It was not a lonely pair of cities in a wilderness, but a whole broad, populous, interconnected civilization. Far to the east of Mohenjo-daro, in what is now India, lay great cities of its own. One of them, on the banks of a long-vanished river, may have been as large as Harappa itself or larger. A huge settlement only now being fully uncovered, its mounds giving up, season by season, the same story of streets and drains and seals and skill. And in the dry lands to the south, there rose a city unlike the mud-brick towns of the plain, a city built largely of stone, its great walls and gateways cut and fitted from the rock. Here the people wrestled, magnificently, with the deepest problem of their dry land, water. They carved vast reservoirs into the ground and built dams and channels to catch and hoard every drop of the scarce rains. A monument to the same genius for water we saw in Mohenjo-daro, raised here against a far harsher sky. It is worth pausing on that, for it shows the range of these people. On the wet plain, they built to manage the flood and carry the water away. In the parched south, they built to capture the rain and hold it fast. The same civilization, the same ingenious care, adapting itself perfectly to utterly different lands, patient, practical, and endlessly resourceful in the face of whatever the water did. Across this whole enormous world ran the roads and the rivers and the sea lanes that bound it together, the arteries of trade along which the seals and the weights and the beads and the grain all flowed. A merchant might carry goods from a stone city in the dry south to a brick city on the northern plain, and find at journey's end the same weights, the same measures, the same script, the same familiar order. It was, in its quiet way, a single connected world. And how astonishing that it held together at all, across such distances without, as far as we can see, a single emperor to command it or an army to enforce it. Whatever wove this vast civilization into one was not conquest, and not a central throne, but something subtler, a shared way of life, a common set of standards, a web of trade and trust, held in the minds and habits of a whole far-flung people. It is one of the great wonders of the human story, and one of its best-kept secrets, that here, at the very dawn of cities, a civilization arose that was larger than any other of its time, and that ran, for 1,000 years, on order and trade and quiet competence rather than on kings and conquest. We are only now, city by newly uncovered city, beginning to grasp how great and how strange it truly was. And of all its cities, there is one more we must visit before the long ending begins, a small but extraordinary place down near the sea, where the people of the Indus reached out to the ocean itself. For here, it seems, they built something that may be the oldest of its kind in the world, a great dock where their ships could come in from the sea. Let us go down to the water's edge, to the port they called, well, we do not know what they called it. We call it Lot Hell. Far to the south and east, near where the land met the sea, stood a smaller city that played a special part in the life of the Indus world. It was a town of craftsmen and traders, famous for its beads, its warehouses, and its bustling workshops. But its greatest wonder lay along one side of the town, a huge basin of brick, long and deep, that has puzzled and amazed everyone who has studied it. For most who have examined it believe this great brick basin was a dockyard, a built harbor, where boats and ships could be brought in from the nearby waters, moored, loaded, and unloaded, and made ready for their voyages. If they are right, it is one of the earliest such structures known anywhere on Earth, a purpose-built dock, raised by the people of the Indus at the very dawn of seafaring. Picture the care of its making. A great rectangular basin, its walls of fired brick laid true and sealed, with a channel to let the water in from the tidal river, and a clever arrangement, it seems, to keep the water at the right level for the boats even as the tide rose and fell outside. Beside it ran a wharf, and behind the wharf warehouses where the goods could be stored as they came and went. Here, then, we can stand at the very edge of the Indus world, where it opened out onto the wider ocean. Imagine the boats coming in on the tide, flat-bottomed river craft and stouter seagoing vessels, laden with goods from up and down the coast and from across the Gulf. Imagine the bustle of the wharf, the unloading, the weighing, the sealing, the carrying of bundles into the warehouses, the whole busy commerce of a working port. And in the workshops of the town, the craftsmen made the goods that these ships would carry away. Lothal was famous, above all, for its beads, and here the archaeologists found a beadmaker's workshop, with its little furnace and its tools and its half-finished beads, exactly as it was left, a small frozen moment of ancient work, as if the craftsman had just stepped away and might return at any moment. From this port and others like it, the ships of the Indus set out along the coast and across the sea toward the west, toward the Gulf and the great cities of Mesopotamia beyond, carrying the beads and the cotton and the carnelian and the copper of the Indus out into the wider world. Here the quiet river civilization touched the ocean and reached across the water to the very edges of the known earth. There is something wonderful in imagining it. This modest, kingless, orderly people, so often pictured only in their inland brick cities, standing here at the sea's edge, building docks and warehouses, launching ships onto the ocean, trading with distant lands across the waves. Their reach was not only broad across the land, it stretched out, too, over the water, as far as their sturdy ships could carry them. And the little dock at Lothal, if that is truly what it was, stands as a fitting emblem of the whole civilization. Practical, ingenious, quietly ambitious, and astonishingly far ahead of its time. A people solving the hard problems of the real world, wave and tide and cargo and trade, with the same patient competence they brought to their bricks and their drains and their weights. So we have seen this world at its fullest reach. Its great cities and its small ones, its inland plains and its ocean ports, its vast extent and its shared and gentle order, its trade stretching to the ends of the earth. A civilization at the very height of its long and quiet flourishing. And yet, even now, far off and slow and almost silent, the forces were gathering that would, in time, bring the whole shining world of the Indus quietly to its end. For something like 1,000 years, the great cities of the Indus flourished, orderly, prosperous, peaceful, and clean. 1,000 years, longer than most empires last, longer than most nations have yet existed. But nothing made by human hands lasts forever, and slowly, quietly, in ways no single person living through them could have grasped, the tides began to turn against this gentle world. And here we must be careful and honest, for the ending of the Indus is not a story with a clear villain or a single dramatic blow. For a long time, people imagined a violent end, an invasion, a conquest, the cities put to the sword. But the deeper the archaeologists have dug, the less they have found of any such thing. There is no great layer of ash and slaughter, no evidence of a conquering army sweeping the cities away. The truth is at once quieter and sadder. For the enemy that undid the Indus was not an army. It was the slow, vast, impersonal turning of the earth and sky themselves, the shifting of the climate, the changing of the rains, the wandering and drying of the very rivers on which this whole civilization had been built. The end came not with a roar, but with a long, slow, gathering silence. Remember how utterly this world depended on its water. The rivers gave the yearly flood that fed the fields. The monsoon rains gave the land its life. The whole delicate order of cities and trade and abundance rested, in the end, upon the faithful coming of the water year after year after year. And now, over long generations, that faithful rhythm began, almost imperceptibly, to falter. The great pattern of the seasons, the scholars believe, was slowly changing. The monsoon, the life-giving summer rains, seems to have grown weaker and less reliable over the centuries, its bounty slowly shrinking. Year by year, the change would have been far too small to notice, but decade upon decade, century upon century, the land grew a little drier, the harvests a little less sure, the margin between plenty and want a little thinner. For a civilization so finely balanced upon its water, this was a deep and dangerous thing. When the rains are generous, a great population can be fed, and cities can grow, and trade can flourish, and life can be easy. But let the rains falter, and the harvests shrink, and that same great population becomes a burden the land can no longer easily bear. The very success of the Indus made it vulnerable to the slow failing of the water. Imagine it, spread across many lifetimes. A run of poorer harvests, a well that has to be dug deeper, a field at the margin abandoned, a season of hunger where once there was plenty. No single disaster, just a slow, grinding, generation by generation tightening, as the land gave a little less each age, and the old easy abundance became a memory, and then a legend, and then was forgotten. And there was worse to come than the failing rains, for the very rivers themselves, the great arteries of this world, were beginning to move and to die. In a land whose whole life clung to the waters, the wandering and drying of the rivers was a blow at the very heart of everything. To understand the fall of the Indus, we must follow the fate of one river above all, a mighty river that, over these long centuries, simply dried up and vanished from the earth. For alongside the Indus itself there ran, in those days, another great river system to the east, a mighty water or a chain of them, flowing down across the plain, along whose banks stood a great many of the civilization's cities and towns. It was as vital to the eastern half of the Indus world as the Indus was to the west. And over the centuries of the civilization's long life, this great eastern river began, slowly and terribly, to fail. The reasons lay deep in the earth and sky, in the shifting of the rains that fed it, and perhaps in slow changes to the very courses of the rivers among the distant mountains, so that waters that had once flowed into it were captured away by other streams. Whatever the tangle of causes, the result over long ages was merciless. The great river shrank and broke into pools and dwindled to a seasonal trickle, and at last, in places, dried entirely away. Picture what that meant for the cities and towns strung along its banks. Everything they were depended on that water, the fields, the wells, the trade, the very possibility of life in that place. And now, across generations, the water was leaving them. The river that had made them was abandoning them, drop by drop, year by year, and there was nothing, in all their ingenuity and order and quiet competence, that they could do to call it back. Let us walk, in imagination, the banks of that dying river, across the long, slow centuries of its failing. In the early days it runs full and strong, and the cities along it thrive, and the fields are green, and all is well. The people cannot imagine that anything will ever change. The river has always been here and always will be. It is the deepest assumption of their world. But the change comes so slowly that no one lifetime can see it whole. A grandfather remembers the water higher than his grandson will ever see it. An old woman recalls fields now dust that were green when she was a girl. The river in living memory is always a little lower, a little narrower, a little less sure than it was, and always the people hope that the good years will return, and for a while sometimes they do, and then the long decline resumes. And as the water fails, the delicate order of the Indus world begins, quietly, to come apart. A town at the river's edge finds its wells running dry and its fields turning to dust, and slowly its people drift away to somewhere the water is still good. Then another town and another. The great connected web of the civilization, all those settlements bound together by trade and the shared way of life, begins to fray and thin as its threads, one by one, wither with the water. The Indus itself, the great western river, did not dry, but it, too, seems to have grown wild and unruly in these centuries, shifting its mighty course across the plain, flooding where it had not flooded before, abandoning old channels, tormenting the cities that depended on its faithfulness. Even the mightiest river was no longer the steady, reliable giver it had been, and the whole finely tuned system that the Indus people had built upon it began to shake. And as the harvests failed and the trade thinned and the towns emptied, the great cities themselves began to suffer. The population that clean water and rich fields had once so easily fed became too great for a shrinking land to bear. The wealth that flowed in from far-off trade dwindled as the network frayed. The confident order of centuries began, slowly, to loosen and to fade. We can see it faintly in the ruins. In the later levels of the great cities, the fine standards seem to slip. The careful town planning grows a little ragged. Old grand buildings are subdivided into smaller, humbler dwellings. The once immaculate streets are encroached upon. The whole proud order frays a little at the edges. The civilization is not being destroyed. It is quietly, wearily, running down. There is no drama in it, and that is what makes it so poignant. No burning, no battle, no last stand upon the walls. Just a long, slow, gentle fading. A great civilization growing old and tired and thin, as the water that was its lifeblood slowly withdrew, and the land could support less and less of the shining life that had once flourished upon it. And the people, through all of this, did what people have always done in the face of a land that can no longer feed them. They moved. Not in a single great exodus, not in panic or flight, but slowly, family by family, generation by generation, drifting away from the failing cities and the dying rivers toward places where the water was still good and life was still possible. And which way did they go? Away from the drying west and the dying eastern river, and toward the east and the south, toward other rivers that still ran full, toward the great valley of the Ganges and the lands beyond, where the rains were surer and the earth was green. The center of gravity of their world shifted, over the long generations, away from the old heartland and toward new country. So the ending of the Indus was, in truth, a great slow migration as much as a fall. A whole people, over centuries, quietly picking up their lives and carrying them elsewhere, abandoning the wonderful cities their ancestors had built because the water that had made those cities possible was gone. And as they went, the great work of 1,000 years was left behind them, to the dust and the silence and the wandering river. Watch, then, one of the great cities in its final centuries as the long ebb runs on. Fewer people walk its streets each generation. Houses stand empty and are not repaired and slowly crumble. The great public works, the drains, the wells, the walls, are no longer maintained as once they were. There are not the hands, nor the wealth, nor perhaps the shared will to keep them up. The fine old order softens and blurs. Where once every brick was made to the perfect standard, now the work grows rougher. Where once the streets ran clean and clear, now the drifting dust gathers, and the encroaching walls narrow them. The seals are made less finely, the far trade dwindles, the exact little weights are used less, as the wide world they serve draws in and grows small. The signature of the civilization slowly fades from its own cities. It is important to understand that the people did not suddenly become fewer or lesser in themselves. They were the same clever, capable folk they had always been. But the great system that had bound them together, the trade, the standards, the cities, the shared order across a vast land, that system was coming apart as the water that underpinned it failed, and there was no putting it back together. The civilization was dissolving even as the people lived on. Think of it as a great piece of music slowly running down, the players drifting away one by one, the grand shared symphony breaking into scattered solitary notes, until at last the melody that had sounded across the whole plain for 1,000 years could no longer be heard at all. Not silenced by any hand, simply, slowly, faded into stillness. And so, one by one, the great cities came at last to their end. The day arrived. No one can say exactly when, for such endings have no single hour, when the last families gathered up what they could carry and walked out through the crumbling gates of Mohenjo-daro, of Harappa, and turned their faces toward wherever the water still ran, and did not come back. Behind them they left the wonderful cities to the sun and the wind and the drifting sand. The empty streets, the silent great bath, the abandoned wells, the workshops with their tools laid down, the little seals dropped and forgotten, with their unread writing and their proud carved bulls. All of it left behind to the slow, patient work of the burying earth. The rains, such as they were, washed the mud brick walls a little lower each year. The wind heaped the dust against them. The wandering river laid down its silt. And season by season, century by century, the great cities sank slowly back into the plain from which they had risen, until they were only long, low mounds of rubble and dust, giving no hint of the shining, ordered world that lay buried within them. And the memory of them faded even faster than the walls. The people who had moved away built new lives in new lands, and their children knew the old cities only as tales, and their children's children not even as that. Within a few generations, the very knowledge that these had once been great cities the heart of a mighty civilization, was simply gone. Forgotten as if it had never been. It is one of the most complete forgettings in all of human history. Egypt never forgot its pyramids. They stood in plain sight down all the ages. Rome left its ruins towering over Europe. But the Indus vanished so utterly that, for nearly 4,000 years, no one anywhere on Earth knew that it had ever existed, that beneath those low, dusty, nameless mounds on the river plain lay one of the very first and greatest civilizations of humankind. The people, of course, lived on. Their descendants are among us still, woven into the great populations of the land where they once flourished. But the cities and the civilization, and the whole shining, ordered world of the Indus passed entirely out of human memory, and lay silent and unknown beneath the plain, waiting through the long, slow turning of the millennia for someone, at last, to remember. But before we follow the cities down into their long sleep, let us pause on a gentler truth, for though the civilization ended, its people did not vanish from the earth. They simply became something new, and they carried with them, into the ages that followed, more of the old world than they can ever have known. As they drifted eastward and southward over the generations, toward the Ganges and the greener lands, they did not forget how to farm, or to make pots, or to work metal, or to weave cotton, or to string beads. All the deep skills of the Indus traveled with them in their hands, and passed into the villages and the peoples among whom they settled, and lived on, changed and continued, long after the great cities were dust. And more than skills went with them. We spoke before of the possible threads reaching forward into the faiths of later India, the reverence for bathing and pure water, the seated meditating figure, the sacred peepal tree, the mother goddess of the fertile earth. If these threads are real, then the spiritual heart of the Indus did not die with its cities either, but flowed on, hidden into the great river of belief that still runs through that land today. Even their love of order and measure may have left its mark. Some scholars trace echoes of the Indus system of weights and measures in the standards of later ages. And the deep, practical, patient competence of these people, their genius for water, for cleanliness, for building well and living well together, such things do not simply vanish. They sink into the ground of a culture and quietly nourish whatever grows there next. So we should not think of the Indus as a civilization that failed exactly or that was destroyed. It is truer and kinder and more accurate to think of it as a civilization that transformed, that, when its cities could no longer stand, dissolved gently back into the great stream of human life from which it had risen, carrying its gifts downstream into the future, into peoples and faiths and habits that endure to this day. There is a deep consolation in that if we choose to see it. The bricks crumbled, the rivers died, the writing fell silent, the very name was lost. And yet the people went on, and their children went on, and something of what they had made and loved and believed went on with them. Quietly, namelessly, woven into the long, unbroken fabric of human life in that ancient and enduring land. Picture, then, not an ending but a passing on. The last of the city folk walking east under a wide sky, toward new rivers and new fields, carrying their tools and their seeds and their skills and their old half-remembered ways. The living seed of the Indus, scattering out across the land to take root again, elsewhere in new and humbler and enduring forms. And behind them, the mounds settled into silence, and the centuries began to pass over them. The long, slow, patient centuries in which the very existence of the Indus would be utterly forgotten. Empires would rise and fall in that land, and great new cities, and mighty faiths, and none of them would know that beneath the old dusty hills by the river lay the bones of a civilization far older and stranger than any of them. For nearly 4,000 years the cities kept their silence. The sun rose and set over the low mounds of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and the wind moved the dust, and the river wandered the plain, and no one who passed had the least idea of the wonder that lay buried beneath their feet. The greatest of forgotten worlds slept on, patient and hidden, beneath the ordinary earth. And then, in an age almost within living memory, that long silence was at last broken, and in the strangest and most accidental of ways. For the lost cities of the Indus were not, at first, discovered by scholars searching for a lost civilization. They were very nearly destroyed, unknowing, by people who thought the ancient mounds were nothing more than a convenient heap of old bricks. To that final, remarkable chapter we now come. Let us go forward now across all those silent millennia to a time not so very long ago, to an age of engineers and railways, when a great line was being built across the plains of the land we now call Pakistan, to carry the trains of a new and industrial age across the old and ancient country. The builders of that railway needed vast quantities of hard, solid material to make the bed on which the tracks would rest good, firm ballast to hold the rails steady. And as they worked their way across the plain, they came upon a wonderful and convenient resource, great mounds out in the countryside that proved to be made of millions upon millions of hard, well-fired ancient bricks. To the railway builders, these mounds were simply a quarry, an inexhaustible supply of ready-made brick, sitting there for the taking. And so they took them. Cartload after cartload of ancient brick was carried away from the mounds and broken up and laid down beneath the railway tracks. For many miles, the trains of the modern age would run upon a bed made of the shattered bricks of a civilization no one knew existed. Think of the strange poignancy of that. The careful, standardized, lovingly fired bricks of Harappa, made by hands 4,000 years dead, to build the clean streets and comfortable homes of a great lost people, dug up and smashed to gravel to bear the weight of the passing trains. The city that had been forgotten so completely was very nearly carried away entirely, brick by brick, before anyone realized what it was. But not everyone who saw those mounds was blind to them. Now and then, over the years, a curious traveler or an early antiquarian would notice something odd, strange little carved stones turning up in the rubble, seals bearing an unknown animal and a line of unreadable signs. A few of these curiosities were collected and puzzled over and set aside. No one yet grasped what they meant, but the questions were beginning to gather. For those little seals were troubling. They bore a script like no other known writing on earth. They came from mounds that were clearly very old. And slowly, in the minds of a few careful scholars, a suspicion began to grow that these were not the leavings of any known ancient people, not the Persians nor the Greeks nor any civilization named in the histories, but the traces of something older and unknown and waiting to be understood. And so, at last, in the earlier part of the 20th century, the systematic work began. Archaeologists came to the great mounds, to Harappa, so damaged by the brick robbers, and to the greater and better preserved mound far to the south that the local people called the Mound of the Dead, Mohenjo-daro. And they began carefully to dig. And what they found astonished the world. Not a village, not a modest ruin, but a great city, street after planned street of fine brick houses, wells and drains and bathrooms, a mighty citadel, a great sealed bath, workshops and warehouses, and everywhere those little seals with their proud animals and their unreadable script. And another such city to the north, and hints of many more, all sharing the same astonishing culture. As they dug deeper and dated what they found, the true scale of the discovery broke upon them. This was no minor lost town. This was a whole civilization, vast, ancient, sophisticated, utterly unknown to history, as old as Egypt and Sumer and as great, and in some ways more advanced and completely, totally forgotten. In a few short years, the human story itself had to be rewritten to make room for it. Imagine the wonder of those first archaeologists, standing in the uncovered streets of Mohenjo-daro, as the meaning of what they had found slowly dawned upon them. Here was a great city, thousands of years old, with a plan more orderly than many a modern town, with drains and wells and bathrooms, with a grid of streets, with all the marks of a rich and sophisticated life, and no one, in all the long records of history, had ever so much as mentioned it. And as more was uncovered, the twin cities, and then the smaller towns, and then, over the following decades, the astonishing spreading map of hundreds upon hundreds of sites across a territory larger than Western Europe, the sheer size of the lost civilization came clear. It took its place suddenly and undeniably beside Egypt and Mesopotamia as one of the very first great civilizations of humankind, the one that had been utterly forgotten. Season by season, decade by decade, the patient work went on, and the silent cities gave up their treasures. The great bath, the granaries, the workshops, the drains. The little bronze dancing girl in her easy pose, the meditating stone face we call the priest king. The countless beautiful seals with their bulls and their unicorns. The exact little weights, the toys and the beads and the painted pots. Piece by piece, a whole vanished world was carried back up into the light. And with every discovery, the same deep questions gathered and would not go away. Who were these people? How did they govern themselves with no sign of kings? What did they believe with no sign of temples? What was the great bath for? What did the unicorn mean? And above all, always maddeningly, above all, what did their writings say? A whole civilization stood revealed and stayed silent and asked its riddles and would not answer them. For that is the strange gift and the strange frustration of the Indus. We have recovered so much, their streets and their homes, their crafts and their trade, their skill and their order and their quiet peace. We can see them more clearly, in some ways, than we can see many peoples who left long written records, See how they lived and washed and worked and adorned themselves. And yet the one thing we most long for, their own voice, their own words, remains locked away behind the unread script. So the work goes on to this very day. The seals are studied, the signs are counted and compared. The great computers are set to hunt for the pattern that might, at last, unlock the language. New sites are dug. New pieces are added to the map. The picture grows richer and fuller with every passing year. And somewhere out there, perhaps, in the ground or in a museum drawer, lies the key that will finally let the Indus speak. But whether that key is ever found or not, the lost world has already returned to us, raised up out of 4,000 years of silence, given back its cities and its crafts and its quiet, astonishing greatness, if not yet its voice. The forgotten civilization is forgotten no longer. And we, tonight, have walked its streets and marveled at its order, and stood before its beautiful, patient, unanswered silence. And so the cities returned to the earth, and the long silence closed over them. But think for a moment of what these quiet people were. In a world that would soon be full of god-kings and conquerors, of pyramids raised to glorify the dead and palaces raised to overawe the living, the people of the Indus built, instead, clean streets and public wells, careful drains and modest homes of nearly equal size. They left us no boasts. They carved no monuments to their own greatness. They simply lived well and in good order for 1,000 years, and let their cities speak for them. And in a way, they never entirely vanished at all. When their cities emptied, the people did not cease to be. They drifted eastward, and their children's children became part of the great tapestry of the land we now call India. Some of what they loved seems to have traveled with them down the long generations. A reverence for bathing and clean water, a seated figure crowned like a lord of the beasts, small habits of the sacred that echo, faintly, in a living culture more than 4,000 years later. And still, on their little seals, the writing waits. Thousands of those elegant, unread signs sit in glass cases and museum drawers around the world, patient as they have always been, keeping the name this people called themselves, and the words of their prayers, and the small secrets of their days, locked away just beyond our reach. Perhaps one day someone will find the key, and the Indus will finally speak. Or perhaps they will keep their silence forever. There is a strange and gentle beauty in that, too. But all of that can wait for the morning. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The great river is dark and slow now. The brick streets are cool and empty beneath a wide and starry sky, and the long journey of this story has finally come to rest. So let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve. Sleep now and sleep deeply. The lost cities will keep their quiet watch in the dark, as they have for 4,000 years, and another gentle story will be waiting for you, whenever you are ready to listen again. Good night.